Life is complex. Join us for the simple gifts of wisdom, love, and delight in the written word.
Plato's Republic, Book 10, Part 1. Indeed, I said, our city has many features that assure me that we were entirely right in founding it as we did. And when I say this, I'm especially thinking of poetry. What about it in particular? Glaucon said. That we didn't admit any that is imitative. Now that we have distinguished the separate parts of the soul, it is even clearer, I think, that such poetry should be altogether excluded. What do you mean? Between ourselves, for you won't denounce me to the tragic poets or any of the other imitative ones. All such poetry is likely to distort the thought of anyone who hears it, unless he has the knowledge of what it is really like, as a drug to counteract it. What exactly do you have in mind in saying this? I'll tell you, even though the love and respect I've had for Homer since I was a child make me hesitate to speak. For he seems to have been the first teacher and leader of all these fine tragedians. All the same, no one is to be honored or valued more than the truth. So, as I say, it must be told. That's right. Listen then, or rather, answer. Ask, and I will. Could you tell me what imitation in general is? I don't entirely understand what sort of thing imitations are trying to be. Is it likely, then, that I'll understand? That wouldn't be so strange, for people with bad eyesight often see things before those whose eyesight is keener. Well, that's so. But even if something occurred to me, I wouldn't be eager to talk about it in front of you, so I'd rather that you did the looking. Do you want us to begin our examination, then, by adopting our usual procedure? As you know, we customarily hypothesize a single form in connection with each of the many things to which we apply the same name. Or don't you understand? I do. Then let's now take any of the manys you like. For example, there are many beds and tables. Of course. But there are only two forms of such furniture, one of the bed and one of the table. Yes. And don't we also customarily say that their makers look towards the appropriate form in making the beds or tables we use? And similarly, in the other cases? Surely no craftsman makes the form itself. How could he? There's no way he could. Well, then, see what you'd call this craftsman. Which one? The one who makes all the things that all the other kinds of craftsmen severally make. Well, that's a clever and wonderful fellow you're talking about. Wait a minute, and you'll have even more reason to say that. For this same craftsman is able to make not only all kinds of furniture, but all plants that grow from the earth, all animals, including himself, the earth itself, the heavens, the gods, all the things in the heavens and in Hades beneath the earth. Well, he'd be amazingly clever. You don't believe me? Tell me, do you think there's no way any craftsman could make all these things? Or that in one way he could, and in another he couldn't? Don't you see that there is a way in which you yourself could make all of them? What way is that? It isn't hard. You could do it quickly and in lots of places, especially if you were willing to carry a mirror with you, for that's the quickest way of all. With it, you can quickly make the sun, the things in the heavens, the earth, yourself, the other animals, manufactured items, plants, and everything else mentioned just now. Yes, I could make them appear, but I couldn't make the things themselves as they truly are. Well put. You've extracted the point that's crucial to the argument. I suppose that the painter, too, belongs to this class of makers, doesn't he? Of course. But I suppose you'll say that he doesn't truly make the things he makes. Yet, in a certain way, the painter does make a bed, doesn't he? Yes, he makes the appearance of one. What about the carpenter? Didn't you just say that he doesn't make the form, which is our term for the being of a bed, but only a bed? Yes, I did say that. Now, if he doesn't make the being of a bed, he isn't making that which is, but something which is like that which is, but is not it. So, If someone were to say that the work of a carpenter or any other craftsman is completely that which is, wouldn't he risk saying what isn't true? Well, that at least would be the opinion of those who busy themselves with arguments of this sort. Then let's not be surprised if the carpenter's bed, too, turns out to be a somewhat dark affair in comparison to the true one. All right. Then, do you want us to try to discover what an imitator is by reference to these same examples? I do if you do. We get, then, these three kinds of beds. The first is in nature a bed. And I suppose we'd say that a god makes it. Or does someone else make it? No one else, I suppose. The second is the work of a carpenter. Yes. And the third is the one the painter makes. Isn't that so? It is. Then the painter, carpenter, and God correspond to three kinds of bed? Yes, three. Now, the god, either because he didn't want to, or because it was necessary for him not to do so, didn't make more than one bed in nature, but only one, the very one that is the being of a bed. Two or more of these have not been made by the god and never will be. Why is that? Because if he made only two, then again one would come to light whose form they in turn would both possess, and that would be the one that is the being of a bed, and not the other two. That's right. The god knew this, I think, and wishing to be the real maker of the truly real bed, and not just a maker of a bed, he made it to be the one in nature. Probably so. Do you want us to call him its natural maker, or something like that? It would be right to do so, at any rate, since he is by nature the maker of this and everything else. Well, what about a carpenter? Isn't he the maker of a bed? Yes. And is a painter also a craftsman and maker of such things? Not at all. Then what do you think he does do to a bed? He imitates it. He is an imitator of what the others make. That, in my view, is the most reasonable thing to call him. All right. Then wouldn't you call someone whose product is third from the natural one an imitator? I most certainly would. Then this will also be true of a tragedian, if indeed he is an imitator. He is by nature third from the king and the truth, as are all other imitators. Well, it looks that way. We're agreed about imitators, then. Now, tell me this about a painter. Do you think he tries in each case to imitate the thing itself in nature, or the works of a craftsman? The works of a craftsman. As they are, or as they appear? You must be clear about that. Well, how do you mean? Like this. If you look at a bed from the side, or the front, or from anywhere else, is it a different bed each time? Or does it only appear different, without being different at all? And is that also the case with other things? Well, that's the way it is. It appears different without being so. Then consider this very point. What does painting do in each case? Does it imitate that which is as it is? Or does it imitate that which appears as it appears? Is it an imitation of appearances or of truth? Oh, of appearances. Then imitation is far removed from the truth, for it touches only a small part of each thing, and a part that is itself only an image. And that, it seems, is why it can produce everything. For example, we say that a painter can paint a cobbler, a carpenter, or any other craftsman, even though he knows nothing about these crafts. Nevertheless, if he is a good painter and displays his painting of a carpenter at a distance, he can deceive children and foolish people into thinking that it is truly a carpenter. Of course. Then this, I suppose, is what we must bear in mind in all these cases. Hence, whenever someone tells us that he has met a person who knows all the crafts as well as all the other things that anyone else knows, and that his knowledge of any subject is more exact than any of theirs is, we must assume that we're talking to a simple-minded fellow who has apparently encountered some sort of magician or imitator and been deceived into thinking him omniscient, and that the reason he has been deceived is that he himself can't distinguish between knowledge, ignorance, and imitation. Ah, Socrates, that's absolutely true. Then we must consider tragedy and its leader, Homer. The reason is this. We hear some people say that poets know all crafts, all human affairs concerned with virtue and vice, and all about the gods as well. They say that if a good poet produces fine poetry, he must have knowledge of the things he writes about, or else he wouldn't be able to produce it at all. Hence, we have to look to see whether those who tell us this have encountered these imitators and have been so deceived by them that they don't realize that their works are at the third remove from that which is, and are easily produced without knowledge of the truth, since they are only images, not things that are. Or whether there is something in what these people say, and good poets really do have knowledge of the things most people think they write so well about. Yes, we must certainly look into it. Do you think that someone who could make both the thing imitated and its image would allow himself to be serious about making images and put this at the forefront of his life as the best thing to do? No, I don't. I suppose that, if he truly had knowledge of the things he imitates, he'd be much more serious about actions than about imitations of them, would try to leave behind many fine deeds as memorials to himself, and would be more eager to be the subject of a eulogy than the author of one. I would suppose so, for these things certainly aren't equally valuable or equally beneficial either. Then let's not demand an account of any of these professions from Homer or the other poets. Let's not ask whether any of them is a doctor rather than an imitator of what a doctor says, or whether any poet of the old or new school has made anyone healthy, as Asclepius did, or whether he has left any students of medicine behind, as Asclepius did his sons. And let's not ask them about the other crafts either. Let's pass over all that. But about the most important and most beautiful things of which Homer undertakes to speak, warfare, generalship, city government, and people's education, about these it is fair to question him, asking him thus, Homer, if you're not third from the truth about virtue, the sort of craftsman of images that we defined an imitator to be, but if you're even second, and capable of knowing what ways of life make people better in private or in public, then tell us which cities are better governed because of you, as Sparta is because of Lycurgus, and as many others, big and small, are because of many other men. What city gives you credit for being a good lawgiver who benefited it, as Italy and Sicily do to Charondas, and as we do to Solon? Who gives such credit to you? Will he be able to name one? I suppose not, for not even the Homeridae make that claim for him. Well, then, is any war in Homer's time remembered that was won because of his generalship and advice? No, none. Or, as befits a wise man, are many inventions and useful devices in the crafts or sciences attributed to Homer, as they are to Thales of Miletus, and Anacharsis, the Scythian? There's nothing of that kind at all. Then, if there's nothing of a public nature, are we told that, when Homer was alive, he was a leader in the education of certain people who took pleasure in associating with him in private, and that he passed on a Homeric way of life to those who came after him, just as Pythagoras did? Pythagoras is particularly loved for this, and even today his followers are conspicuous for what they call the Pythagorean way of life. Again, Socrates, we're told nothing of this kind about Homer. If the stories about him are true, his companion, Creophilus, seems to have been an even more ridiculous example of education than his name suggests. For they tell us that while Homer was alive, Creophilus completely neglected him. They do tell us that. But, Glaucon, if Homer had really been able to educate people and make them better, if he'd known about these things and not merely about how to imitate them, wouldn't he have had many companions and been loved and honored by them? Protagoras of Abdera, Prodicus of Chios, and a great many others are able to convince anyone who associates with them in private that he wouldn't be able to manage his household or city unless they themselves supervise his education. And they are so intensely loved because of this wisdom of theirs, that their disciples do everything but carry them around on their shoulders. So do you suppose that, if Homer had been able to benefit people and make them more virtuous, his companions would have allowed either him or Hesiod to wander around as rhapsodes? Instead, wouldn't they have clung tighter to them than to gold, and compelled them to live with them in their homes? Or, if they failed to persuade them to do so, wouldn't they have followed them wherever they went until they had received sufficient education? Seems to me, Socrates, that what you say is entirely true. Then shall we conclude that all poetic imitators, beginning with Homer, imitate images of virtue and all the other things they write about, and have no grasp of the truth? As we were saying just now, a painter, though he knows nothing about cobblery, can make what seems to be a cobbler to those who know as little about it as he does, and who judge things by their colors and shapes. That's right. And in the same way, I suppose, we'll say that a poetic imitator uses words and phrases to paint colored pictures of each of the crafts. He himself knows nothing about them, but he imitates them in such a way that others, as ignorant as he, who judge by words, will think he speaks extremely well about cobblery, or generalship, or anything else whatever, provided, so great is the natural charm of these things, that he speaks with meter, rhythm, and harmony. For if you strip a poet's work of their musical colorings, and take them by themselves, I think you know what they look like. You've surely seen them. I certainly have. Don't they resemble the faces of young boys who are neither fine nor beautiful after the bloom of youth has left them? Absolutely. Now, consider this. We say that a maker of an image, an imitator, knows nothing about that which is, but only about its appearance. Isn't that so? Yes. Then let's not leave the discussion on this point halfway, but examine it fully. Go ahead. Don't we say that a painter paints reins and a mouth-bit? Yes. And that a cobbler and metal worker makes them? Of course. Then does a painter know how the reins and mouth-bit have to be? Or is it the case that even a cobbler and metal worker who made them don't know this, but only someone who knows how to use them, namely a horseman? Well, that's absolutely true. And won't we say that the same holds for everything? What? That for each thing there are these three crafts, one that uses it, one that makes it, and one that imitates it. Yes. Then aren't the virtue or excellence, the beauty and correctness of each manufactured item, living creature, and action related to nothing but the use for which each is made or naturally adapted? They are. It's wholly necessary, therefore, that a user of each thing has most experience of it, and that he tell a maker which of his products performs well or badly in actual use. A flute player, for example, tells a flute maker about the flutes that respond well in actual playing, and prescribes what kind of flutes he is to make, while the maker follows his instructions. Of course. Then doesn't the one who knows give instructions about good and bad flutes, and doesn't the other rely on him in making them? Yes. Therefore, a maker, though associating with and having to listen to the one who knows, has right opinion about whether something he makes is fine or bad, but the one who knows is the user. That's right. Does an imitator have knowledge of whether the things he makes are fine or right through having made use of them? Or does he have right opinion about them through having to consort with the one who knows and being told how he is to paint them? No, neither. Therefore an imitator has neither knowledge nor right opinion about whether the things he makes are fine or bad. No, apparently not. Then a poetic imitator is an accomplished fellow when it comes to wisdom about the subjects of his poetry. Hardly. Nonetheless, he'll go on imitating, even though he doesn't know the good or bad qualities of anything. But what he'll imitate, it seems, is what appears fine or beautiful to the majority of people who know nothing. Of course.
'Tis the gift to be simple. 'Tis the gift to be free. 'Tis the gift to come down where we ought to be. And when we find ourselves in the place just right, 'twill be in the valley of love and delight. When true simplicity is gained, to bow and to bend, we will not be ashamed. To turn, turn will be our delight, till by turning, turning, we come round right. Life is complex. Join us for the simple gifts of wisdom, love, and delight in the written word.
Plato's Republic, Book 10, Part 2. It seems, then, that we're fairly well agreed that an imitator has no worthwhile knowledge of the things he imitates, that imitation is a kind of game, and not something to be taken seriously, and that all the tragic poets, whether they write in iambics or hexameters, are as imitative as they could possibly be. Well, that's right, Socrates. Then is this kind of imitation concerned with something that is third from the truth, or what? Yes, it is. And on which of a person's parts does it exert its power? What do you mean? This. Something looked at from close at hand doesn't seem to be the same size as it does when it is looked at from a distance. No, it doesn't. And something looks crooked when seen in water and straight when seen out of it, while something else looks both concave and convex because our eyes are deceived by its colors. And every other similar sort of confusion is clearly present in our soul. And it is because they exploit this weakness in our nature that trompe-l'oeil painting, conjuring, and other forms of trickery have powers that are little short of magical. Oh, that's true. And don't measuring, counting, and weighing give us most welcome assistance in these cases, so that we aren't ruled by someone's looking bigger, smaller, more numerous, or heavier, but by calculation, measurement, or weighing? Of course. And calculating, measuring, and weighing are the work of the rational part of the soul. They are indeed. But when this part has measured, and has indicated that some things are larger or smaller, or the same size as others, the opposite appears to it at the same time. Yes. And didn't we say that it is impossible for the same thing to believe opposites about the same thing at the same time? We did, and we were right to say it. Then the part of the soul that forms a belief contrary to the measurements couldn't be the same as the part that believes in accord with them. No, it couldn't. Now, the part that puts its trust in measurement and calculation is the best part of the soul. Of course. Therefore, the part that opposes it is one of the inferior parts in us. Well, necessarily. This, then, is what I wanted to get agreement about when I said that painting and imitation as a whole produce work that is far from the truth, namely, that imitation really consorts with a part of us that is far from reason, and the result of their being friends and companions is neither sound nor true. That's absolutely right. Then imitation is an inferior thing that consorts with another inferior thing to produce an inferior offspring. So it seems. Does this apply only to the imitations we see, or does it also apply to the ones we hear, the ones we call poetry? It probably applies to poetry as well, Socrates. However, we mustn't rely solely on a mere probability based on the analogy with painting. Instead, we must go directly to the part of our thought with which poetic imitations consort, and see whether it is inferior or something to be taken seriously. Yes, we must. Then let's set about it as follows. We say that imitative poetry imitates human beings acting voluntarily or under compulsion, who believe that, as a result of these actions, they are doing either well or badly, and who experience either pleasure or pain in all this. Does it imitate anything apart from this? No, nothing. Then is a person of one mind in all these circumstances? Or, just as he was at war with himself in matters of sight, and held opposite beliefs about the same thing at the same time, does he also fight with himself and engage in civil war with himself in matters of action? But there is really no need for us to reach agreement on this question now, for I remember that we already came to an adequate conclusion about all these things in our earlier arguments, when we said that our soul is full of a myriad of such oppositions at the same time. And rightly so, Socrates. It was right, but I think we omitted some things that we must now discuss. What are they? We also mentioned somewhere before that if a decent man happens to lose his son or some other prized possession, he'll bear it more easily than the other sorts of people. Certainly. But now let's consider this. Will he not grieve at all? Or, if that's impossible, will he be somehow measured in his response to pain? The latter is closer to the truth. Now, tell me this about him. Will he fight his pain and put up more resistance to it when his equals can see him, or when he's alone by himself in solitude? Oh, he'll fight it far more when he's being seen. But when he's alone, I suppose, he'll venture to say and do lots of things that he'd be ashamed to be heard saying or seen doing. That's right. And isn't it reason and law that tells him to resist his pain, while his experience of it tells him to give in? True. And when there are two opposite inclinations in a person in relation to the same thing at the same time, we say that he must also have two parts. Of course. Isn't one part ready to obey the law wherever it leads him? How so? The law says, doesn't it, that it is best to keep as quiet as possible in misfortunes and not get excited about them? First, it isn't clear whether such things will turn out to be good or bad in the end. Second, it doesn't make the future any better to take them hard. Third, human affairs aren't worth taking very seriously. And, finally, grief prevents the very thing we most need in such circumstances from coming into play as quickly as possible. What are you referring to? Deliberation. We must accept what has happened as we would the fall of the dice, and then arrange our affairs in whatever way reason determines to be best. We mustn't hug the hurt part and spend our time weeping and wailing like children when they trip. Instead, we should always accustom our souls to turn as quickly as possible to healing the disease and putting the disaster right, replacing lamentation with cure. That would be the best way to deal with misfortune at any rate. Accordingly, we say that it is the best part of us that is willing to follow this rational calculation. Clearly. Then won't we also say that the part that leads us to dwell on our misfortunes and to lamentation, and that can never get enough of these things, is irrational, idle, and a friend of cowardice? We certainly will. Now, this excitable character admits of many multicolored imitations, but a rational and quiet character, which always remains pretty well the same, is neither easy to imitate, nor easy to understand when imitated, especially not by a crowd consisting of all sorts of people gathered together at a theater festival, for the experience being imitated is alien to them. Absolutely. Clearly, then, an imitative poet isn't by nature related to the part of the soul that rules in such a character. And if he's to attain a good reputation with the majority of people, his cleverness isn't directed to pleasing it. Instead, he's related to the excitable and multicolored character, since it is easy to imitate. Clearly. Therefore, we'd be right to take him and put him beside a painter as his counterpart. Like a painter, he produces work that is inferior with respect to truth, and that appeals to a part of the soul that is similarly inferior rather than to the best part. So we were right not to admit him into a city that is to be well governed, for he arouses, nourishes, and strengthens this part of the soul, and so destroys the rational one, in just the way that someone destroys the better sort of citizens when he strengthens the vicious ones and surrenders the city to them. Similarly, we'll say that an imitative poet puts a bad constitution in the soul of each individual by making images that are far removed from the truth and by gratifying the irrational part, which cannot distinguish the large and the small, but believes that the same things are large at one time and small at another. That's right, Socrates. However, we haven't yet brought the most serious charge against imitation, namely, that with a few rare exceptions, it is able to corrupt even decent people, for that's surely an altogether terrible thing. It certainly is, if indeed it can do that. Listen then, and consider whether it can or not. When even the best of us hear Homer or some other tragedian imitating one of the heroes, sorrowing and making a long lamenting speech, or singing and beating his breast, you know that we enjoy it, give ourselves up to following it, sympathize with the hero, take his sufferings seriously, and praise as a good poet the one who affects us most in this way. Of course we do. But when one of us suffers a private loss, you realize that the opposite happens. We pride ourselves if we are able to keep quiet and master our grief, for we think that this is the manly thing to do, and that the behavior we praised before is womanish. I do realize that. Then are we right to praise it? Is it right to look at someone behaving in a way that we would consider unworthy and shameful, and to enjoy and praise it rather than being disgusted by it? No, by God, that doesn't seem reasonable. No, at least not if you look at it in the following way. How? If you reflect, first, that the part of the soul that is forcibly controlled in our private misfortunes, and that hungers for the satisfaction of weeping and wailing, because it desires these things by nature, is the very part that receives satisfaction and enjoyment from poets. And, second, that the part of ourselves that is best by nature, since it hasn't been adequately educated either by reason or habit, relaxes its guard over the lamenting part when it is watching the sufferings of somebody else. The reason it does so is this. I think that there is no shame involved for it in praising and pitying another man who, in spite of his claim to goodness, grieves excessively. Indeed, it thinks that there is a definite gain involved in doing so, namely pleasure, and it wouldn't want to be deprived of that by despising the whole poem. I suppose that only a few are able to figure out that enjoyment of other people's sufferings is necessarily transferred to our own, and that the pitying part, if it is nourished and strengthened on the sufferings of others, won't be easily held in check when we ourselves suffer. Well, that's very true. And doesn't the same argument apply to what provokes laughter? If there are any jokes that you yourself would be ashamed to tell, but that you very much enjoy hearing, and don't detest as something evil in comic plays or in private, aren't you doing the same thing as in the case of what provokes pity? The part of you that wanted to tell the jokes, and that was held back by your reason, for fear of being thought a buffoon, you then release, not realizing that, by making it strong in this way, you will be led into becoming a figure of fun where your own affairs are concerned. Oh, yes, indeed. And in the case of sex, anger, and all the desires, pleasures, and pains that we say accompany all our actions, poetic imitation has the very same effect on us. It nurtures and waters them, and establishes them as rulers in us when they ought to wither and be ruled. For that way we'll become better and happier rather than worse and more wretched. I can't disagree with you. And so, Glaucon, when you happen to meet those who praise Homer, and say that he's the poet who educated Greece, that it's worth taking up his works in order to learn how to manage and educate people, and that one should arrange one's whole life in accordance with his teachings, you should welcome these people and treat them as friends, since they're as good as they're capable of being. And you should agree that Homer is the most poetic of the tragedians, and the first among them. But you should also know that hymns to the gods and eulogies to good people are the only poetry we can admit into our city. If you admit the pleasure-giving muse, whether in lyric or epic poetry, pleasure and pain will be kings in your city instead of law, or the thing that everyone has always believed to be the best, namely, reason. Oh, that's absolutely true. Then let this be our defense, now that we've returned to the topic of poetry, that, in view of its nature, we had reason to banish it from the city earlier, for our argument compelled us to do so. But in case we are charged with a certain harshness and lack of sophistication, let's also tell poetry that there is an ancient quarrel between it and philosophy, which is evidenced by such expressions as the dog yelping and shrieking at its master, great in the empty eloquence of fools, the mob of wise men that has mastered Zeus, and the subtle thinkers beggars all. Nonetheless, if the poetry that aims at pleasure and imitation has any argument to bring forward that proves it ought to have a place in a well-governed city, we, at least, would be glad to admit it, for we are well aware of the charm it exercises. But, be that as it may, to betray what one believes to be the truth is impious. What about you, Glaucon? Don't you feel the charm of the pleasure-giving muse, especially when you study her through the eyes of Homer? Very much so. Therefore, isn't it just that such poetry should return from exile when it has successfully defended itself, whether in lyric or any other meter? Certainly. Then we'll allow its defenders, who aren't poets themselves but lovers of poetry, to speak in prose on its behalf, and to show that it not only gives pleasure, but is beneficial both to constitutions and to human life. Indeed, we'll listen to them graciously, for we'd certainly profit if poetry were shown to be not only pleasant, but also beneficial. How could we fail to profit? However, if such a defense isn't made, we'll behave like people who have fallen in love with someone, but who force themselves to stay away from him because they realize that their passion isn't beneficial. In the same way, because the love of this sort of poetry has been implanted in us by the upbringing we have received under our fine constitutions, we are well disposed to any proof that it is the best and truest thing. But if it isn't able to produce such a defense, then, whenever we listen to it, we'll repeat the arguments we have just now put forward like an incantation, so as to preserve ourselves from slipping back into that childish passion for poetry which the majority of people have. And we'll go on chanting that such poetry is not to be taken seriously, or treated as a serious undertaking with some kind of hold on the truth, but that anyone who is anxious about the constitution within him must be careful when he hears it, and must continue to believe what we have said about it. I completely agree. Yes, for the struggle to be good rather than bad is important, Glaucon. Much more important than people think. Therefore, we mustn't be tempted by honor, money, rule, or even poetry into neglecting justice and the rest of virtue. After what we've said, I agree with you, Socrates, and so, I think, would anyone else.
'Tis the gift to be simple. 'Tis the gift to be free. 'Tis the gift to come down where we ought to be. And when we find ourselves in the place just right, 'twill be in the valley of love and delight. When true simplicity is gained, to bow and to bend, we will not be ashamed. To turn will be our delight, till by turning, we come round right. Life is complex. Join us for the simple gifts of wisdom, love, and delight in the written word.
Plato's Republic, Book 10, Part 3. And yet we haven't discussed the greatest rewards and prizes that have been proposed for virtue. They must be inconceivably great if they're greater than those you've already mentioned. Could anything really great come to pass in a short time? And isn't the time from childhood to old age short when compared to the whole of time? It's a mere nothing. Well, do you think that an immortal thing should be seriously concerned with that short period of time rather than the whole of time? I suppose not, but what exactly do you mean by this? Haven't you realized that our soul is immortal and never destroyed? He looked at me with wonder and said, "No, by God, I haven't." "Are you really in a position to assert that?" "I'd be wrong not to," I said, "and so would you, for it isn't difficult." It is for me, so I'd be glad to hear from you what's not so difficult about it. Listen then. Just speak, and I will. Do you talk about good and bad? I do. And do you think about them in the same way I do? What way is that? The bad is entirely coterminous with what destroys and corrupts, and the good is what preserves and benefits. Oh, I do. And do you say that there is a good and a bad for everything? For example, ophthalmia for the eyes, sickness for the whole body, blight for grain, rot for wood, rust for iron or bronze. In other words, is there, as I say, a natural badness and sickness for pretty well everything? There is. And when one of these attaches itself to something, doesn't it make the thing in question bad? And in the end, doesn't it disintegrate it and destroy it wholly? Of course. Therefore, the evil that is natural to each thing and the bad that is peculiar to it destroy it. However, if they don't destroy it, nothing else will. For the good would never destroy anything, nor would anything neither good nor bad. Well, how could they? Then if we discover something that has an evil, that makes it bad, but isn't able to disintegrate and destroy it, can't we infer that it is naturally incapable of being destroyed? Probably so. Well, what about the soul? Isn't there something that makes it bad? Certainly. All the things we were mentioning: injustice, licentiousness, cowardice, and lack of learning. Does any of these disintegrate and destroy the soul? Keep your wits about you. And let's not be deceived into thinking that when an unjust and foolish person is caught, he has been destroyed by injustice, which is evil in a soul. Let's think about it this way instead. Just as the body is worn out, destroyed, and brought to the point where it is a body no longer by disease, which is evil in a body, so all the things we mentioned just now reach the point at which they cease to be what they are through their own peculiar evil, which attaches itself to them and is present in them. Isn't that so? Yes. Then look at the soul in the same way. Do injustice and the other vices that exist in a soul, by their very presence in it and by attaching themselves to it, corrupt it and make it waste away until, having brought it to the point of death, they separate it from the body? That's not at all what they do. But surely it's unreasonable to suppose that a thing is destroyed by the badness proper to something else when it is not destroyed by its own? That is unreasonable. Keep in mind, Glaucon, that we don't think that a body is destroyed by the badness of food, whether it is staleness, rottenness, or anything else. But if the badness of the food happens to implant in the body an evil proper to a body, we'll say that the body was destroyed by its own evil, namely, disease. But since the body is one thing, and food another, we'll never judge that the body is destroyed by the badness of food, unless it implants in it the body's own natural and peculiar evil. Now that's absolutely right. By the same argument, if the body's evil doesn't cause an evil in the soul that is proper to the soul, we'll never judge that the soul, in the absence of its own peculiar evil, is destroyed by the evil of something else. We'd never accept that anything is destroyed by an evil proper to something else. That's also reasonable. Then let's either refute our argument and show that we were wrong, or, as long as it remains unrefuted, let's never say that the soul is destroyed by a fever, or any other disease, or by killing either, for that matter, not even if the body is cut up into tiny pieces. We mustn't say that the soul is even close to being destroyed by these things until someone shows us that these conditions of the body make the soul more unjust and more impious. When something has the evil proper to something else in it, but its own peculiar evil is absent, we won't allow anyone to say that it is destroyed, no matter whether it is a soul or anything else whatever. And you may be sure that no one will ever prove that the souls of the dying are made more unjust by death. But if anyone dares to come to grips with our argument, in order to avoid having to agree that our souls are immortal, and says that a dying man does become more vicious and unjust, we'll reply that, if what he says is true, then injustice must be as deadly to unjust people as a disease, and those who catch it must die of it, because of its own deadly nature, with the worst cases dying quickly, and the less serious dying more slowly. As things now stand, however, it isn't like that at all. Unjust people do indeed die of injustice, but at the hands of others who inflict the death penalty on them. By God, Socrates, if injustice were actually fatal to those who contracted it, it wouldn't seem so terrible, for it would be an escape from their troubles. But I rather think that it's clearly the opposite, something that kills other people if it can, while on top of making the unjust themselves lively, it even brings them out at night. Hence it's very far from being deadly to its possessors. You're right. For if the soul's own evil and badness isn't enough to kill and destroy it, an evil appointed for the destruction of something else will hardly kill it. Indeed, it won't kill anything at all except the very thing it is appointed to destroy. Hardly is right, or so it seems. Now, if the soul isn't destroyed by a single evil, whether its own or something else's, then clearly it must always be. And if it always is, it is immortal. Necessarily so. So be it. And if it is so, then you realize that there would always be the same souls, for they couldn't be made fewer if none is destroyed, and they couldn't be made more numerous either. If anything immortal is increased, you know that the increase would have to come from the mortal, and then everything would end up being immortal. That's true. Then we mustn't think such a thing, for the argument doesn't allow it. Nor must we think that the soul in its truest nature is full of multicolored variety and unlikeness, or that it differs with itself. What do you mean? It isn't easy for anything composed of many parts to be immortal if it isn't put together in the finest way. Yet this is how the soul now appeared to us. It probably isn't easy. Yet our recent argument, and others as well, compel us to believe that the soul is immortal. But to see the soul as it is in truth, we must not study it as it is while it is maimed by its association with the body and other evils, which is what we were doing earlier, but as it is in its pure state. That's how we should study the soul, thoroughly and by means of logical reasoning. We'll then find that it is a much finer thing than we thought, and that we can see justice and injustice as well as all the other things we've discussed far more clearly. What we've said about the soul is true of it as it appears at present, but the condition in which we've studied it is like that of the sea god Glaucus, whose primary nature can't easily be made out by those who catch glimpses of him. Some of the original parts have been broken off, others have been crushed, and his whole body has been maimed by the waves and by the shells, seaweeds, and stones that have attached themselves to him, so that he looks more like a wild animal than his natural self. The soul, too, is in a similar condition when we study it, beset by many evils. That, Glaucon, is why we have to look somewhere else in order to discover its true nature. To where, Socrates? To its philosophy, or love of wisdom. We must realize what it grasps and longs to have intercourse with, because it is akin to the divine and immortal, and what always is. And we must realize what it would become if it followed this longing with its whole being, and if the resulting effort lifted it out of the sea in which it now dwells, and if the many stones and shells, which have grown all over it in a wild, earthy, and stony profusion because it feasts, as those so-called happy feastings on earth, were hammered off it. Then we'd see what its true nature is, and be able to determine whether it has many parts or just one, and whether or in what manner it is put together. But we're already given a decent account, I think, of what its condition is, and what parts it has when it is immersed in human life. We certainly have. And haven't we cleared away the various other objections to our argument, without having to invoke the rewards and reputations of justice, as you said Homer and Hesiod did? And haven't we found that justice itself is the best thing for the soul itself, and that the soul, whether it has the ring of Gyges, or even it together with the cap of Hades, should do just things? We have. That's absolutely true. Then can there now be any objection, Glaucon, if, in addition to return to justice and the rest of virtue, both the kind and quantity of wages that they obtain for the soul from human beings and gods, whether in this life or the next? None whatever. Then will you give me back what you borrowed from me during the discussion? What are you referring to in particular? I granted your request that a just person should seem unjust, and an unjust one just. For you said that, even if it would be impossible for these things to remain hidden from both gods and humans, still, this had to be granted for the sake of argument, so that justice itself could be judged in relation to injustice itself. Don't you remember that? It would be wrong of me not to. Well then, since they've now been judged, I ask that the reputation justice in fact has among gods and humans be returned to it, and that we agree that it does indeed have such a reputation, and is entitled to carry off the prizes it gains for someone by making him seem just. It is already clear that it gives good things to anyone who is just, and that it doesn't deceive those who really possess it. That's a fair request. Then won't you first grant that it doesn't escape the notice of the gods, at least, as to which of the two is just and which isn't? We will. Then if neither of them escapes the gods' notice, one would be loved by the gods, and the other hated, as we agreed at the beginning. That's right. And won't we also agree that everything that comes to someone who is loved by the gods, insofar as it comes from the gods themselves, is the best possible, unless it is the inevitable punishment for some mistake he made in a former life? Certainly. Then we must suppose that the same is true of a just person who falls into poverty or disease or some other apparent evil, namely, that this will end well for him, either during his lifetime or afterwards. For the gods never neglect anyone who eagerly wishes to become just, and who makes himself as much like a god as a human can by adopting a virtuous way of life. It makes sense that such a person not be neglected by anyone who is like him. And mustn't we suppose that the opposite is true of an unjust person? Definitely. Then these are some of the prizes that a just person, but not an unjust one, receives from the gods. That's certainly my opinion. What about from human beings? What does a just person get from them? Or, if we're to tell the truth, isn't this what happens? Aren't clever but unjust people like runners who run well for the first part of the course, but not for the second? They leap away sharply at first, but they become ridiculous by the end and go off uncrowned, with their ears drooping on their shoulders like those of exhausted dogs. While true runners, on the other hand, get to the end, collect the prizes, and are crowned. And isn't it also generally true of just people that, towards the end of each course of action, association, or life, they enjoy a good reputation and collect the prizes from other human beings? Of course. Then will you allow me to say all the things about them that you yourself said about unjust people? I'll say that it is just people who, when they're old enough, rule in their own cities, if they happen to want ruling office, and that it is they who marry whomever they want and give their children in marriage to whomever they want. Indeed, all the things that you said about unjust people I now say about just ones. As for unjust people, the majority of them, even if they escape detection when they are young, are caught by the end of the race and are ridiculed. And by the time they get old, they've become wretched, for they are insulted by foreigners and citizens, beaten with whips, and made to suffer those punishments such as racking and burning, which you rightly described as crude. Imagine that I've said that they suffer all such things, and see whether you'll allow me to say it. Of course I will. What you say is right. Then these are the prizes, wages, and gifts that a just person receives from gods and humans while he is alive, and that are added to the good things that justice itself provides. Yes, and they're very fine and secure ones, too. Yet they're nothing in either number or size compared to those that await just and unjust people after death. And these things must also be heard, if both are to receive in full what they are owed by the argument. Then tell us about them, for there aren't many things that would be more pleasant to hear.
'Tis the gift to be simple. 'Tis the gift to be free. 'Tis the gift to come down where we ought to be. And when we find ourselves in the place just right, 'twill be in the valley of love and delight. When true simplicity is gained, to bow and to bend, we will not be ashamed. To turn will be our delight, till by turning, we come round right. Life is complex. Join us for the simple gifts of wisdom, love, and delight in the written word.
Plato's Republic, Book 10, Part 4. Then these are the prizes, wages, and gifts that a just person receives from gods and humans while he is alive, and that are added to the good things that justice itself provides. Yes, and they're very fine and secure ones, too. Yet they're nothing in either number or size compared to those that await just and unjust people after death. And these things must also be heard, if both are to receive in full what they are owed by the argument. Then tell us about them, for there aren't many things that would be more pleasant to hear. It isn't, however, a tale of Alcinous that I'll tell you, but that of a brave Pamphylian man called the son of Arminius, who once died in a war. When the rest of the dead were picked up 10 days later, they were already putrefying, but when he was picked up, his corpse was still quite fresh. He was taken home, and preparations were made for his funeral. But on the 12th day, when he was already laid on the funeral pyre, he revived, and, having done so, told what he had seen in the world beyond. He said that, after his soul had left him, it traveled together with many others, until they came to a marvelous place, where there were 2 adjacent openings in the earth, and opposite and above them 2 others in the heavens, and between them judges sat. These, having rendered their judgment, ordered the just to go upwards into the heavens through the door on the right, with signs of the judgment attached to their chests, and the unjust to travel downward through the opening on the left, with signs of all their deeds on their backs. When himself came forward, they told him that he was to be a messenger to human beings about the things that were there, and that he was to listen to and look at everything in the place. He said that he saw souls departing after judgment through one of the openings in the heavens and one in the earth, while through the other 2 souls were arriving. From the door in the earth, souls came up covered with dust and dirt, and from the door in the heavens, souls came down pure. And the souls who were arriving all the time seemed to have been on long journeys, so that they went gladly to the meadow, like a crowd going to a festival, and camped there. Those who knew each other exchanged greetings, and those who came up from the earth asked those who came down from the heavens about the things there, and were in turn questioned by them about the things below. And so they told their stories to one another, the former weeping as they recalled all they had suffered and seen on their journey below the earth, which lasted 1,000 years, while the latter, who had come from heaven, told about how well they had fared, and about the inconceivably fine and beautiful sights they had seen. There was much to tell, Glaucon, and it took a long time, but the main point was this. For each in turn of the unjust things they had done, and for each in turn of the people they had wronged, they paid the penalty 10 times over, once in every century of their journey. Since a century is roughly the length of a human life, this means that they paid a 10-fold penalty for each injustice. If, for example, some of them had caused many deaths by betraying cities or armies and reducing them to slavery, or by participating in other wrongdoing, they had to suffer 10 times the pain they had caused to each individual. But if they had done good deeds and had become just and pious, they were rewarded according to the same scale. He said some other things about the stillborn and those who had lived for only a short time, but they are not worth recounting. And he also spoke of even greater rewards or penalties for piety or impiety towards gods or parents, and for murder with one's own hands. For example, he said he was there when someone asked another where the great Ardiaeus was. This Ardiaeus was said to have been tyrant in some city in Pamphylia 1,000 years before, and to have killed his aged father and older brother, and committed many other impious deeds as well. And he said that the one who was asked responded, "He hasn't arrived here yet, and never will." For this too was one of the terrible sights we saw. When we came near the opening on our way out, after all our sufferings were over, we suddenly saw him together with some others, pretty well all of whom were tyrants, although there were also some private individuals among them who had committed great crimes. They thought that they were ready to go up, but the opening wouldn't let them through, for it roared whenever one of these incurably wicked people, or anyone else who hadn't paid a sufficient penalty, tried to go up. And there were savage men, all fiery to look at, who were standing by. And when they heard the roar, they grabbed some of these criminals and led them away. But they bound the feet, hands, and head of Ardiaeus and the others, threw them down, and flayed them. Then they dragged them out of the way, lacerating them on thorn bushes, and telling every passer-by that they were to be thrown into Tartarus, and explaining why they were being treated in this way. And he said that of their many fears, the greatest each of them had was that the roar would be heard as he came up, and that everyone was immensely relieved when silence greeted him. Such, then, were the penalties and punishments and the rewards corresponding to them. Each group spent 7 days in the meadow, and on the 8th they had to get up and go on a journey. On the 4th day of that journey they came to a place where they could look down from above on a straight column of light that stretched over the whole of heaven and earth, more like a rainbow than anything else, but brighter and more pure. After another day they came to the light itself, and there, in the middle of the light, they saw the extremities of its bonds stretching from the heavens. For the light binds the heavens like the cables girding a trireme, and holds its entire revolution together. From the extremities hang the spindle of necessity, by means of which all the revolutions are turned. Its stem and hook are of adamant, whereas in its whirl adamant is mixed with other kinds of material. The nature of the whirl was this. Its shape was like that of an ordinary whirl, but, from what said, we must understand its structure as follows. It was as if one big whirl had been made hollow by being thoroughly scooped out, with another smaller whirl closely fitted into it, like nested boxes, and there was a third whirl inside the second, and so on, making 8 whirls altogether, lying inside one another, with their rims appearing as circles from above, while from the back they formed one continuous whirl around the spindle, which was driven through the center of the 8th. The first or outside whirl had the widest circular rim. That of the 6th was second in width. The 4th was third. The 8th was 4th. The 7th was 5th. The 5th was 6th. The 3rd was 7th. And the 2nd was 8th. The rim of the largest was spangled. That of the 7th was brightest. That of the 8th took its color from the 7th's shining on it. The 2nd and 5th were about equal in brightness, more yellow than the others. The 3rd was the whitest in color. The 4th was rather red, and the 6th was second in whiteness. The whole spindle turned at the same speed, but, as it turned, the inner spheres gently revolved in a direction opposite to that of the whole. Of these inner spheres, the 8th was the fastest. Second came the 7th, 6th, and 5th, at all the same speed. It seemed to them that the 4th was third in its speed of revolution, the 4th third, and the 2nd 5th. The spindle itself turned on the lap of necessity, and up above on each of the rims of the circle stood a siren, who accompanied its revolution, uttering a single sound, one single note, and the concord of the 8 notes produced a single harmony. And there were 3 other beings sitting at equal distances from one another, each on a throne. These were the Fates, the daughters of necessity, Lachesis, Clotho, and Atropos. They were dressed in white, with garlands on their heads, and they sang to the music of the sirens. Lachesis sang of the past, Clotho of the present, and Atropos of the future. With her right hand, Clotho touched the outer circumference of the spindle and helped it turn, but left off doing so from time to time. Atropos did the same to the inner ones, and Lachesis helped both motions in turn, one with one hand and one with the other. When the souls arrived at the light, they had to go to Lachesis right away. There a speaker arranged under them in order, took from the lap of Lachesis a number of lots, and a number of models of lives, mounted a high pulpit, and spoke to them. Here is the message of Lachesis, the maiden daughter of necessity. Ephemeral souls, this is the beginning of another cycle that will end in death. Your daimon, or guardian spirit, will not be assigned to you by lot. You will choose him. The one who has the first lot will be the first to choose a life, to which he will then be bound by necessity. Virtue knows no master. Each will possess it to a greater or less degree, depending on whether he values or disdains it. The responsibility lies with the one who makes the choice. The god has none. When he had said this, the speaker threw the lots among all of them, and each, with the exception of who wasn't allowed to choose, picked up the one that fell next to him. And the lot made it clear to the one who picked it up where in the order he would get to make his choice. After that, the models of lives were placed on the ground before them. There were far more of them than there were souls present, and they were of all kinds, for the lives of animals were there, as well as all kinds of human lives. There were tyrannies among them, some of which lasted throughout life, while others ended halfway through in poverty, exile, and beggary. There were lives of famous men, some of whom were famous for the beauty of their appearance, others for their strength or athletic prowess, others still for their high birth and the virtue or excellence of their ancestors. And there were also lives of men who weren't famous for any of these things, and the same for lives of women. But the arrangement of the soul was not included in the model because the soul is inevitably altered by the different lives it chooses. But all the other things were there, mixed with each other and with wealth, poverty, sickness, health, and the states intermediate to them. Now, it seems that it is here, Glaucon, that a human being faces the greatest danger of all. And because of this, each of us must neglect all other subjects and be most concerned to seek out and learn those that will enable him to distinguish the good life from the bad, and always to make the best choice possible in every situation. He should think over all the things we have mentioned and how they jointly and severally determine what the virtuous life is like. That way he will know what the good and bad effects of beauty are when it is mixed with wealth, poverty, and a particular state of the soul. He will know the effects of high or low birth, private life or ruling office, physical strength or weakness, ease or difficulty in learning, and all the things that are either naturally part of the soul or are acquired. And he will know what they achieve when mixed with one another. And from all this he will be able, by considering the nature of the soul, to reason out which life is better and which worse, and to choose accordingly, calling a life worse if it leads the soul to become more unjust, better if it leads the soul to become more just, and ignoring everything else. We have seen that this is the best way to choose, whether in life or death. Hence, we must go down to Hades holding with adamantine determination to the belief that this is so, lest we be dazzled there by wealth and other such evils, rush into a tyranny or some other similar course of action, do irreparable evils, and suffer even worse ones. And we must always know how to choose the mean in such lives, and how to avoid either of the extremes, as far as possible, both in this life and in all those beyond it. This is the way that a human being becomes happiest. Then our messenger from the other world reported that the speaker spoke as follows. There is a satisfactory life rather than a bad one available even for the one who comes last, provided that he chooses it rationally and lives it seriously. Therefore, let not the first be careless in his choice, nor the last discouraged. He said that when the speaker had told them this, the one who came up first chose the greatest tyranny. In his folly and greed, he chose it without adequate examination, and didn't notice that, among other evils, he was fated to eat his own children as a part of it. When he examined at leisure the life he had chosen, however, he beat his breast and bemoaned his choice, and, ignoring the warning of the speaker, he blamed chance, daemons, or guardian spirits, and everything else for these evils but himself. He was one of those who had come down from heaven, having lived his previous life under an orderly constitution, where he had participated in virtue through habit and without philosophy. Broadly speaking, indeed, most of those who were caught out in this way were souls who had come down from heaven, and who were untrained in suffering as a result. The majority of those who had come up from the earth, on the other hand, having suffered themselves and seen others suffer, were in no rush to make their choices. Because of this, and because of the chance of the lottery, there was an interchange of goods and evils for most of the souls. However, if someone pursues philosophy in a sound manner when he comes to live here on earth, and if the lottery doesn't make him one of the last to choose, then, given what has reported about the next world, it looks as though not only will he be happy here, but his journey from here to there and back again won't be along the rough underground path, but along the smooth, heavenly one. Said that the way in which the souls chose their lives was a sight worth seeing, since it was pitiful, funny, and surprising to watch. For the most part, their choice depended upon the character of their former life. For example, he said that he saw the soul that had once belonged to Orpheus choosing a swan's life, because he hated the female sex because of his death at their hands, and so was unwilling to have a woman conceive and give birth to him. Saw the soul of Thamyris choose the life of a nightingale, a swan choosing to change over to a human life, and other musical animals doing the same thing. The 20th soul chose the life of a lion. This was the soul of Ajax, son of Telamon. He avoided human life because he remembered the judgment about the armor. The next soul was that of Agamemnon, whose sufferings also had made him hate the human race, so he changed to the life of an eagle. Atalanta had been assigned a place near the middle, and when she saw great honors being given to a male athlete, she chose his life, unable to pass them by. After her, he saw the souls of Epius, the son of Panopeus, taking on the nature of a craftswoman. And very close to last, he saw the soul of the ridiculous Thersites, clothing itself as a monkey. Now, it chanced that the soul of Odysseus got to make its choice last of all. And since memory of its former sufferings had relieved its love of honor, it went around for a long time, looking for the life of a private individual who did his own work, and with difficulty it found one lying off somewhere neglected by the others. He chose it gladly, and said that he'd have made the same choice even if he'd been first. Still other souls changed from animals into human beings, or from one kind of animal into another, with unjust people changing into wild animals, and just people into tame ones, and all sorts of mixtures occurred. After all the souls had chosen their lives, they went forward to Lachesis in the same order in which they had made their choices, and she assigned to each the daimon it had chosen as guardian of its life and fulfiller of its choice. This daimon first led the soul under the hand of Clotho as it turned the revolving spindle to confirm the fate that the lottery and its own choice had given it. After receiving her touch, he led the soul to the spinning of Atropos, to make what had been spun irreversible. Then, without turning around, they went from there under the throne of necessity, and when all of them had passed through, they traveled to the plain of forgetfulness in burning, choking, terrible heat, for it was empty of trees and earthly vegetation. And there, beside the river of unheeding, whose water no vessel can hold, they camped, for night was coming on. All of them had to drink a certain measure of this water, but those who weren't saved by reason drank more than that, and as each of them drank, he forgot everything and went to sleep. But around midnight there was a clap of thunder and an earthquake, and they were suddenly carried away from there, this way and that, up to their berths, like shooting stars. Himself was forbidden to drink from the water. All the same, he didn't know how he had come back to his body, except that waking up suddenly he saw himself lying on the pyre at dawn. And so, Glaucon, his story wasn't lost, but preserved. And it would save us, if we were persuaded by it, for we would then make a good crossing of the river of forgetfulness, and our souls wouldn't be defiled. But if we are persuaded by me, we'll believe that the soul is immortal, and able to endure every evil and every good, and we'll always hold to the upward path, practicing justice with reason in every way. That way we'll be friends both to ourselves and to the gods while we remain here on earth and afterwards. Like victors in the games who go around collecting their prizes, we'll receive our rewards. Hence, both in this life and on the 1,000-year journey we've described, we'll do well and be happy.
'Tis the gift to be simple. 'Tis the gift to be free. 'Tis the gift to come down where we ought to be. And when we find ourselves in the place just right, 'twill be in the valley of love and delight. When true simplicity is gained, to bow and to bend, we will not be ashamed. To turn will be our delight, till by turning, we come round right.